Assalamu alaikum, friends, and welcome to this lecture, which is going to be about the Quranic understandings of the divine name according to the Jewish tradition. So, according to the Jewish tradition in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Exodus, or in the Torah, in other words, when Moses asks God what is the name that he should tell the people about the God who sent him, the divine name was given or revealed to Moses. And this is like during the theophany or during the divine revelation to Moses. And according to Jewish tradition, this divine name is not pronounced. So, like modern Jews, including, for example, rabbinic Jews also in the past many centuries, they do not usually pronounce the divine name. They only have it in the four letters of the Hebrew language, and there are no vowels. And so in reality, nobody really, according to the Jewish tradition, nobody really knows exactly how to pronounce the divine name. According to the Jewish tradition, it used to be pronounced in the past, during the temple period, by the high priest, and only during specific times of the year, like during, for example, Yom Kippur. But otherwise, it is a name that is not usually pronounced according to the Jewish tradition. And the four letters that make up this divine name is Yod, He, Vav, He. Yod, He, Vav, He. And so, we would like to actually see and explore if the Quran recognizes the divine name given to Moses according to the Jewish tradition, and if it does recognize it, does it understand what it could mean? So what is the meaning of this divine name? So this is what I will be exploring along with all of you in this lecture. So, we will be looking into figuring out if the Quran is aware of the divine name of God narrated in the Hebrew Bible, Yod He Vav He, and if it does recognize it, if it is aware of it, how does it define it and how does it understand it? So obviously, when we look into the Quran, nowhere in the Quran does it actually show the divine name Yod He Vav He. Well, obviously, of course, it's in the Hebrew language, right? The divine name is in the Hebrew language. The Quran is in the Arabic language. And so, obviously, it's not there. However, even if it is not there clearly, does it really mean that the Quran does not know it? Well, this is the issue of what we would call that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What do we mean by that? In other words, okay, so just like in other words. Let's say, for example, that we do not have evidence of fossils of dogs living in Shiraz 4,000 years ago. Does that mean that there were no dogs in Shiraz 4,000 years ago just because we do not have fossil evidence of those dogs? No, right? So this is what we mean, that the absence of the evidence is not really evidence of absence. So, even though the Quran never explicitly mentions the divine name, according to the Jewish tradition, Yod He Vav He, does that really mean that the divine name is absent from the Quran? I will attempt to answer the question about whether the Quran knows the divine name according to the Jewish tradition, Yod He Vav He, and if it does does it even understand it, by actually looking into an unanswered question. So I will attempt to answer the question with an unanswered question. What do I mean by that? According to the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Exodus, in the Torah in other words, when God asks Moses to go to Pharaoh, to ask Pharaoh to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt. So when Moses goes to Pharaoh, so when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they ask Pharaoh, this is what God commands. This is what Yod He Vav He commands to let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh asks a question. Pharaoh asks, who is Yod He Vav He? Who is this God of yours whom you are calling Yod He Vav He? I do not know Yod He Vav He. I do not know your God, Yod He Vav He. So I will not let the Israelites go. According to the Exodus account, when Pharaoh asks the question, who is Yod He Vav He? He never receives a response from either Moses or Aaron. And this is what I mean, that I will try to answer the question about the Quran, and if it knows the divine name and how it understands the divine name, with this unanswered question in the Exodus account in the Jewish tradition. And why is that? For a very simple reason. Because when the Quran re-articulates the narrative of the conversation that occurs between Moses with Aaron and Pharaoh, the Quran actually gives Pharaoh an answer, even though the Exodus account does not give Pharaoh an answer. And because of that, I will try to show how the Quran understands the divine name Yod He Vav He through the narratives about the encounter between Pharaoh and Moses with Aaron. However, before we even start, we need to first ask, who are the Jews of Arabia who lived during the 7th century? Who were those Jews? Because we need to really contextualize the Quran according to its socio-historical context. Because if the Quran was in conversation with its audience, especially, for example, its Jewish audience, we need to try to figure out, okay, well, who exactly were the Quran's audience? Who were the Jewish audience of the Quran? What did they know about the divine name, Yod He Vav He, right? So we need to contextualize the Quran to its historical setting. And so we have to ask ourselves, who are the Jews of Arabia? So, when we look into the Jewish communities in late antique Arabia during the 7th century, we actually see that there were a diverse number of different Jewish communities. So there were many different kinds of Jewish communities within Arabia. Some of those Jewish communities could have been rabbinic. And perhaps most of them may have been mainly in north of Arabia, especially in the Nabatean region. But they also existed in south of Arabia as well. They have been living there, and we do have some evidence of them living in south of Arabia no later than the 4th century. So even before the Quran, before Islam emerged, we had communities who, even if we don't necessarily call them rabbinic Judaism, but they were Jewish communities that were very well aware of rabbinic traditions. So they existed in north of Arabia, and they also existed in south of Arabia. And so in between the north and the south, you have the Hijaz, which is in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, where, of course, according to Muslim tradition, is where Islam emerged. So if the Jews who were aware of rabbinic traditions existed in north of Arabia, existed in south of Arabia, so they must have also passed through the Hijaz when where Islam also emerged. However, it wasn't only rabbinic Judaism that was known during that time in Arabia, but there were also other Jewish communities that also existed alongside, such as in the Himyarite kingdom. So the Himyarite kingdom existed in south of Arabia, in what we today perhaps would call Yemen, or even parts of the southern parts of modern day Saudi Arabia and Yemen as well. So the Himyarite kingdom basically had a Jewish community, but that Jewish community, according to many historians, were not exactly as Jewish as many people understand Judaism. They may be called like quasi-Jews. So they're somewhat Jewish. And one of the main reasons why they were somewhat Jewish is because many of the Jews of that community they were converts to Judaism, and according to some historians, they believe that they converted to Judaism perhaps for political rather than for theological reasons. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now, since we understand that there were really many different kinds of Jewish communities in Arabia during late antiquity, we would like to figure out how was the divine name understood by those different communities. So how did they actually handle, in other words, not understood, but mainly, how did they handle the divine name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh? So what did exactly they do? Because remember what I said earlier, is that according to the Jewish tradition, the divine name wasn't typically pronounced. So we would like to see how was it handled by the different Jewish communities in late antiquity? Did they all not pronounce it? Did some of them pronounce it? So let's look at each of the different communities that existed, the Jewish communities that existed in Arabia during that time. So the rabbinic Jews, or the Jews who accepted, of course, or recognized the rabbinic traditions, they avoided pronouncing or vocalizing, they avoided pronouncing the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. And they replaced it with Adonai, which means my Lord, or sometimes they replaced it with Hashem, which means the name. So instead of pronouncing the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, they would replace wherever it exists. For example, if they are reciting the Torah, for example, whenever they recite it, they replace the divine name with my Lord, Adonai, okay, or Hashem, the name. So this is basically the Jewish communities that we could call perhaps somewhat rabbinic, or who have accepted rabbinic traditions. However, when we look into the quasi-Jews as well, we also see that the quasi-Jews appear to have avoided the use or even pronouncing the divine name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. And they also replaced it with the Arabic Rabb, because the majority of the quasi-Jews in the Himyarite kingdom were Arabs, and so they were Arabic speaking, and so they replaced it with the Arabic term Rabb, which means Lord. So that's how they replaced Yod He Vav He. When we look into Ethiopian Jews, and by the way, Ethiopian Jews, historically speaking, had been very much isolated from the rabbinic traditions. However, even though they were very much isolated from the rabbinic traditions, they also avoided the vocalization of the divine name Yod He Vav He, and they replaced it with Egzi'a Beher, which means Lord of the Nations. Okay, so as we could see, pretty much many of those different Jewish communities, they all avoided the vocalization of the divine name Yod He Vav He and replacing it with the terms for Lord according to their own languages, whether, in Arabic, Aramaic, or Ethiopian, right? So they replaced it with the term Lord or the name according to their own language. However, there is also another community that also existed, the Samaritans. The Samaritans also avoided the vocalization or the pronunciation of the divine name Yod He Vav He, and they replaced it with Shema, meaning the name, right? Like the Arabic ism, right? So they replaced it with Shema, which means the name. So as we could see, all the different Jewish communities avoided the pronunciation of the divine name, and they all replace it with either Rabb or the name, right? The Lord or the name. Now, if we look into the Hebrew Bible, where is Yod He Vav He? Where do we see the divine name? Actually, it's quite interesting that in the Hebrew Bible, you will see the divine name everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It's there more than 6,000 times. But at the same time, you will see it nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. And some of you will now ask, what in the world does he mean? In what ways is the divine name everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, but at the same time, nowhere in the Hebrew Bible? Very simple. The divine name is everywhere in the written form, in literary form, in written form. It is written everywhere. So in the text, you will find it written everywhere. However, when the text is recited, you will find it nowhere. So for example, in the scrolls of the Torah, you will find Yod He Vav He written everywhere, right? Throughout the scroll of the Torah, in text, right? Everywhere. But when the Jews recite the Torah from those scrolls, the oral recitation will not show the divine name Yod He Vav He, because, as I just said, that the Jewish communities, all the different Jewish communities, avoided the pronunciation of the divine name Yod He Vav He. And that is what I mean, that in reality, even though Yod He Vav He is everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, at the same time it is nowhere. It is everywhere in text, but it is nowhere in oral recitation. And that is very important to keep in mind. So now that's a question we also like to ask. If the Quran avoids Yod He Vav He, right, explicitly, it doesn't write those letters. The name itself, it doesn't write. Like, for example, with other names, it writes their names. Like, Abraham in Hebrew is Ibrahim in Arabic, and the Quran writes the name Ibrahim, right? But it doesn't write the name Yod He Vav He explicitly. It doesn't write it. Does this mean that the Quran was oral? Because if the Quran was oral, then obviously if the Jews did not pronounce the divine name Yod He Vav He, then the Quran will also have no way to even recognize how it could be pronounced. Because even if, for example, the reciter of the Quran wanted to recite Yod He Vav He, the Jewish community would not have recognized what is being recited, because they wouldn't even know how Yod He Vav He was pronounced. Because remember, according to the rabbinic tradition, the name was only pronounced in the temple period by the high priest and only during certain holidays, especially Yom Kippur. And that is when the Jewish community during Second Temple period, they heard the divine name pronounced. But we're talking now in the 7th century. So we're talking centuries later. So centuries later, many of the Jewish communities at the time would have had no idea how the divine name was even pronounced many centuries ago. So perhaps, the non-existence of the divine name in the Quran is simply because the Quran is oral. And just as the Hebrew Bible in its oral recitation by the Jewish communities would never pronounce Yod He Vav He, the Quran also never pronounced it, and therefore because it started orally, it never writes the name, right? Because the written form of the Quran only came later. And by the way, even if the Quran was dictated by the reciter to someone who would immediately write it down. So even, theoretically speaking, we don't know exactly, of course, the genesis of the Quran, historically speaking, whether it started orally or whether it started in written form. But even if someone did write it down by dictation, meaning that the reciter recited it and dictated it to the person writing it down, still, if someone was dictating the Quran, it still means that it started orally, right? And therefore the reciter would not have pronounced Yod He Vav He, and so the one who was writing it down, right? So the person who was being dictated the Quran and writing down the Quran would not have written down Yod He Vav He because they would not have been dictated that name, right? Because the person who's reciting it is not also pronouncing the name Yod He Vav He. However, there is no way to know for sure, by the way. So I'm not even suggesting for sure that the Quran necessarily started orally. But I'm simply saying perhaps it is likely. Okay, so it's possibly, maybe the reason why the Quran never mentions the name explicitly Yod He Vav He is because it started orally. But it's not necessarily so. Because even when we look into the Jewish texts, for example, when we look into the Targums, the translations of the Hebrew Bible, in Aramaic, we also see that those translations, those Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, they also do not translate Yod He Vav He. They also replace it with other terms, such as the Lord, or the name, or sometimes even in Aramaic, it replaces it with the term, the Word. Okay, the Word. Even, for example, during the Second Temple period, there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible known as the Septuagint. So even in the Greek translation during the Second Temple period, which according to Jewish traditions, one would have assumed that perhaps there were Jews who knew how to pronounce even the divine name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, because they may have heard the high priest pronouncing it on Yom Kippur at the temple. So even though they may even have known how to pronounce it, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible never transliterates the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. Instead, it also replaces it with the Lord. So it also replaces it with the Greek for the Lord. By the way, even when you open the New Testament, the Greek writers of the New Testament, whether it's the Gospels or the different epistles, for example, so even the New Testament does not write down the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. And the writers of the New Testament were mostly Jews, if not all. I mean, there scholars, of course, they would question on whether some of the authors of the New Testament, whether they were, some of them may have been converts to Judaism or so and so. But regardless, some of them were obviously Jews, right, during the Second Temple period. So some of them were obviously Jewish, and yet they also did not write the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh in Greek in the New Testament. Even, for example, when they quote the Hebrew Bible, so even when New Testament authors, they bring quotations from the Hebrew Bible, they also do not transliterate the name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. So we have to keep that in mind. So even in textual format, in literary format, many of the Jews did not translate the Hebrew Bible or quote the Hebrew Bible with the using of the term Yod-Heh or the divine name Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. Instead, they replace it with another term, such as the Lord or the name or the word or something similar. So that is why, as I said, the absence of Yod-Heh Vav-Heh could possibly point to us that the Quran emerged and started orally. I mean, even if it was dictated to someone, it still means it started orally. But even if the author of the Quran wrote the Quran, but because the Quran is in Arabic and it's really maybe, alluding to some stories found in the Hebrew Bible, and whenever, it's talking about Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, it would still not write down the actual name as Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, just as the Jews did not even in their own translations of the Hebrew Bible translate it as Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. So there is no way for us to know for sure whether it really means that the Quran started orally or in textual format, but I feel that maybe it's more likely oral rather than textual. But who knows? We don't really have full evidence to really answer this question thoroughly yet. When we look into the Quranic narratives of the theophany to Moses, meaning when God revealed God's self to Moses at the burning bush, we actually see something interesting in those narratives, is that wherever the Hebrew Bible has Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, the Quran replaces it with the Arabic term for Rabb, perhaps in a similar way to how the Jews treated the divine name. Okay, so let us now proceed and see what exactly or how did it all really start. So is the Quran abstaining from vocalizing the divine name just like the Jewish communities around it? So that when it converses and engages with those communities, they would recognize that the Quran is really talking about Yod He Vav He without actually pronouncing Yod He Vav He. Well, one of the things some people may ask is, for example, well, why would the Quran avoid the vocalization of the divine name? Could it not, for example, simply just pronounce it? Because even though in the Jewish tradition there is this, tradition of abstaining from pronouncing the divine name Yod He Vav He, some people would ask, well, but in Islamic tradition, right, in the Muslim tradition, they feel that there is no such a thing as, abstaining from pronouncing the divine name. However, in reality, there is. And I will tell you where that is. According to some Muslim traditions, having a hidden name of God is not something alien or foreign. It's not something strange, in other words, because there is a concept in some of the Muslim traditions known as Ismullah al-A'zam, the greatest name of God. According to the Muslim traditions, the Ismullah al-A'zam is a hidden name of God that nobody knows except whoever God chooses. And so it's very important to keep in mind that it's not a foreign or a strange idea that there is a name that God has that nobody knows in the Muslim tradition, right? Because it does exist, very similar perhaps to the concept or idea of Yod He Vav He in the Jewish tradition. Actually, in some of those Muslim traditions that speak about Ismullah al-A'zam, or the greatest name of God, many of those sayings actually suggest that the greatest name of God can perhaps be found in certain Quranic passages. And many of those Quranic passages with which those traditions refer to, they all actually speak of God's oneness. Like, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 163, some traditions suggest that in there, the Ismullah al-A'zam may be found. It talks about the oneness of God. Surah Al-Imran, the first couple of verses of Surah Al-Imran, which also speak of the oneness of God. Some of the Muslim traditions suggests that Ismullah al-A'zam can be found there. Surah Al-Ikhlas is another place where some of the Muslim traditions suggest is where Ismullah al-A'zam can be found. And in addition to all of those, Surah Taha, which actually contains the longest narrative of Moses in the whole Quran. And in it, it also contains one of the main narratives of the theophany to Moses. And what do I mean by the theophany to Moses? I mean the God's self-revelation to Moses. So when God reveals God's self to Moses. And it's very important, and it's what I will be analyzing very closely in this lecture. So many of those Muslim traditions suggest that Ismullah al-A'zam can be found in these passages of the Quran. Actually, many of those passages, they mirror or reflect the Jewish Shema. What is the Jewish Shema? The Jewish Shema is the declaration of the Jewish faith. Just like, for example, the Muslims have the Shahada, the Tashahhud, right? They witness that there is only one God. in the Jewish tradition, it is the Shema. It comes from the Hebrew Bible, which is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Actually, in Hebrew, it would be written as, Hear, O Israel, Yod He Vav He is our God, Yod He Vav He is one. Okay? And actually, some scholars suggest that Surah Al-Ikhlas actually refers to the Jewish Shema. Especially, for example, the way the Surah Al-Ikhlas says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. It doesn't say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ وَاحِدٌ, which you would have expected in the Arabic language, but it specifically says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, and the usage of the word أحد specifically may reflect the Shema's Echad in Hebrew. So in here we actually see that, many of those traditions perhaps suggest that Ismullah al-A'zam, the greatest name of God, is found in those passages which talk about the oneness of God, which perhaps even mirror, Yod He Vav He in the Jewish tradition. In reality, some Jewish scholars like Yonatan Negev and Hillel ben Sassoon suggest that the Muslim concept of Ismullah al-A'zam, the greatest name of God, may actually have developed from the Jewish treatment of the divine name. So that's a very interesting and noteworthy thing to keep in mind. So let us go back to the beginning, where, according to the Jewish tradition, the divine name Yod He Vav He was first revealed to Moses. So, according to the book of Exodus, the divine name was revealed when Moses saw the burning bush. So Moses saw the burning bush, went closer to the burning bush in order to see, how interesting the burning bush was. And as Moses approached the burning bush, God spoke to Moses. And when God spoke to Moses and told Moses, go to Pharaoh, tell Pharaoh this and that, go to the Israelites, tell them this and that, one of the things that Moses asked God, he asked God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? So Moses was asking in this time at the burning bush, Moses asks God, what should I tell the people about this name of God that sent me? And so God replies to Moses, according to the book of Exodus, God replies to Moses with Ehiyah Esher Ehiyah, which literally means, I will be that I will be. And then God continues saying, say this to the people of Israel, Ehiyah has sent me to you. I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yod He Vav He, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So when we go back to the beginning of when Yod He Vav He was first revealed according to the Jewish tradition as a name for God, it was revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses specifically asked about what is the name that I should tell the people about the one who sent me. Now when we look into the Quranic version of this encounter at the burning bush. So when Moses basically encounters God at the burning bush, and God speaks to Moses at the burning bush, the Quran has several versions of that encounter in different passages in the Quran. In one of those main narratives, it is in Surah Taha. And we would see that in Surah Taha, just before the Quran even narrates the encounter between Moses and God, the Quran actually says, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa lahul asma'ul husna. God, there is no God but He, unto Him belong the most beautiful names. And then it starts talking about the story of Moses at the burning bush. It starts to narrate the story of Moses. What is interesting here is very important, is that just before it gives the story of Moses at the burning bush, it talks about that to God belongs the most beautiful names. And by the way, when we look into some of the other passages in the Quran which talks about the most beautiful names of God, Al-Asma' al-Husna, we see that in some of those other passages, some examples of Al-Asma' al-Husna are given. Some examples of those most beautiful names are given. Like, for example, it says, هو الرحمن الرحيم الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن. Right? So it gives examples of those Asma' al-Husna, those most beautiful names. But in this narrative, even though it speaks about that to God belong the most beautiful names, it never explicitly mentions any special name. It doesn't say, for example, Ar-Rahman, it doesn't say Ar-Rahim, it doesn't give any example of a name of those, of Al-Asma' al-Husna. It means that it seems that the Quran here is very much aware that the narrative it is now about to actually narrate and give the story about Moses at the burning bush is actually about the name of God. Even though it doesn't explicitly mention what exactly that name of God is, it seems that the Quran here implies that, this narrative that I'm going to be talking about, the narrative of Moses, is really talking about one of those most beautiful names of God. So according to this Quranic narrative, it says, have you heard the story of Moses when he saw a fire and said unto his family, stay here, verily I perceive a fire, perhaps I shall bring you a brand therefrom, or find guidance at the fire. Then when he came to the fire, he was called, so God spoke to Moses and said, Inni ana rabbuk, I am your Lord. اخلع نعليك إنك في الوادي المقدس طوى. Take off your sandals. Truly you are in the holy valley of Tuwa. أنا اخترتك. I have chosen you. So listen to what is revealed. إنني أنا الله لا إله إلا أنا. I am God. There is no God but I. So worship me and perform the prayer for the remembrance of me. So this is the version in Surah Taha about the theophany, about when God reveals God's self to Moses at the burning bush. We do see some parallels between this version, this narrative, and the Exodus account. So what are some of those parallels that we see, some of those similarities that we would see between them? So, for example, in the Exodus account, Moses asks God, what is the name that I should tell the people as the one who sent me? So it uses it explicitly asks about the name of God. And we do see this in the narrative in Surah Taha as well. It talks about, to God belongs the most beautiful names. So we do see, for example, this as one point of intertextuality, if you like. God self-identifies with a form of I am in Surah Taha, like Inni ana rabbuk, Innani ana Allah, right? It's not just ana rabbuk, it says Innani ana rabbuk. So I am, right? There's this kind of way that the Quranic version or the Quranic narrative is trying to convey, which is similar to Exodus. In Exodus it says, Ihya ashar ihya. I will be that I will be. So we do see that kind of similarity between them as well. Also, in the Quranic version, God chooses Moses. Ana اخترتك. Right? God chooses. I chooses Moses. Right? Ana اخترتك. In the Exodus version, it says Ihya, sent me, right? So when they basically when Moses is supposed to go and tell the people about who is the one who sent him, it was Ihya who sent him. I or I will be, right? I am or I will be sends Moses. And we also find that in both versions, in Surah Taha as well as in the Exodus account, God commands to be remembered. So for example, in the Exodus account, it says, this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. And in Surah Taha, it says, basically, so worship me and perform the prayer for the remembrance of me. So in both passages, in the Quran and in Exodus, there is this emphasis on God being remembered, especially with a name. In the Exodus account, in the Hebrew Bible, when Moses asks God, what is the name that I should tell the people as the one who sent me? And Moses receives really different responses, right? He receives mainly two responses. One response is Ihya ashar ihya, I will be that I will be. And the second response is Yod He Vav He. Well, how does the Quran translate Ihya ashar ihya? In reality, the Quran has three different versions of God's self-identification to Moses. Three different versions. In three different surahs. So three different versions in three different passages. In one of them, it is Inni ana Allah. In another, it is Innani ana Allah. And maybe some of you will say, okay, this is, just a minor variation. But then there is also a third version. Innahu ana Allah. So we see that in three different places where the Quran actually presents the narrative of how God reveals God's self to Moses, we see three versions of how God reveals God's self to Moses. And what is interesting is that if the Quran is trying to quote the Hebrew Bible, you would have expected that the Quran will always be translating it the same way. But since the Quran is translating the phrase in three different ways, in three different versions, then it seems as if the Quran is deliberately only trying to paraphrase rather than translating this phrase, right? It's only trying to paraphrase it rather than translating it. Because, by the way, I mean, even though each one of those are a good approximation of how to translate ihya ashar ihya, a more literal translation would be akun alladhi akun, I will be that I will be. Because the word ihya in Hebrew is from the verb to be. It is not the first person pronoun. It is not ani, right? So in Hebrew, ani would be ana in Arabic. It would be I. But it is not ani in the Hebrew Bible. It's ihya, which is from the verb to be. And so if I want to translate it literally in Arabic, it would become akun alladhi akun. I will be that I will be. So it seems that the Quran perhaps is deliberately only attempting to paraphrase rather than translate the Hebrew Bible in this specific case. The doubling of the first person pronoun by the Quran, like inni ana or innani ana, I am, or even innahu ana, right? Indeed he is I, in other words, right? So the doubling of this kind of pronouns is not very unusual, by the way. We do find it in the Hebrew Bible. For example, we do see in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, see now that I am he, ani hu, and there is no God besides me. Okay, and there is no God besides ani. So we do see that the doubling of the pronouns, of the first person pronoun, is also used in the Hebrew Bible. There's also another place in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Isaiah, for example, it says, Anochi, Anochi, Yod He Vav He. And also in another part of the book of Isaiah, it also says, Anochi, Anochi Hu, I am He. So this doubling is actually sometimes seen. And some of the biblical scholars, such as, for example, Jacques Van Ruiten, says, any who, I am he, which is very rarely used in the Hebrew Bible. So though the doubling exists, it's very rarely used in the Hebrew Bible. But some of those, biblical scholars suggest that sometimes that when they are used, they function as a derivation of and a substitution for ani yod he vav he. I am yod he vav he. So in other words, instead of writing yod he vav he, the usage of this doubling sometimes, especially with I am he, ani hu, is in order to refer to Yod He Vav He, to refer to God without explicitly having to write Yod He Vav He. So this is something that is interesting. We also see parallels between the verse of Deuteronomy 32:39, which you just saw, saying, Ani hu, I am he, I am he, there is no God besides me, with the Quranic version of the theophany to Moses, when God self-revealed God self to Moses in Surah Taha. So there is a common phraseology between both. For example, in Surah Taha, it basically says, Innani ana Allah, la ilaha illa ana. So I am God, there is no God except I, right? But I. And the same thing we see in Deuteronomy 32:39. It says, Ani hu, I am he, there is no God besides me. So we do see a common phraseology between both. We also see that in both passages it emphasizes that there are no other gods that exist. And in addition to that, we see that in Surah Taha, verse 15, it alludes to the resurrection. It basically says, for example, إِنَّ السَّاعَةَ آتِيَةٌ أَكَادُ أُخْفِيهَا. The hour is about to come and I'm about to keep it hidden. So we do see that there is this allusion to the resurrection. And when we look into verse 32-39 in Deuteronomy, it continues to state, I kill and I make alive, I wound and I heal, which rabbinic literature has actually interpreted as a rebuttal against those who deny the resurrection and the world to come. So basically we do see that even though the verse itself in Deuteronomy may not be very explicit about the resurrection, but the rabbinic tradition reads the resurrection into it. So let me give you actually a few examples from the rabbinic tradition that interprets the resurrection into Deuteronomy 32-39. For example, in one of the rabbinic traditions known as Sifra Devarim, it frequently calls God He who spoke and the world came to being. And the editor of that tradition writes the following on the interpretation of Deuteronomy 32-39. It basically, I'm not going to read it all to you, you can read it yourselves, but you basically see that the editor shows that the passage of Deuteronomy 32-39 is a proof for the resurrection from the Torah. So it basically alludes to the resurrection, even though it may not necessarily be very explicit about it. This rabbinic tradition is not the only tradition that reads the resurrection into Deuteronomy 32-39. There are so many others as well, including the Babylonian Talmud. Even the Babylonian Talmud reads the resurrection into Deuteronomy 32-39. We also find that in other literature as well, including Targum Neofiti, which is an Aramaic interpretation or a translation, an Aramaic translation of 32-39, which also reads the resurrection into it. So we actually see many different rabbinic traditions all read the resurrection into the passage of Deuteronomy 32-39. Therefore, we see that it parallels very much the passages in Surah Taha, at least in the perspective of the rabbinic traditions. I am not going to dwell so much on the many different rabbinic traditions that do also use pronouns or substitute pronouns for the divine name, Yod He Vav He, but there are plenty of them. So I'm not going to go very deep into it, but there are really plenty of them within the rabbinic tradition. By the way, they're not only found in the rabbinic tradition, but they're also found in the Qumran scrolls as well, in which the usage of pronouns are sometimes done in order to refer to the divine name Yod He Vav He. So Yod He Vav He is sometimes referred to using pronouns in order not to use the divine name explicitly in some of the texts. A biblical scholar, Catherine Williams, for example, writes a particularly significant feature of a number of texts discovered at Qumran is their distinctive use of hu or huwa, which is the third person pronoun in the Hebrew language, he in other words, as a designation for God. So some biblical traditions already point to a movement towards the use of who or he as a divine designation. And certain passages in non-biblical texts from Qumran demonstrate that this practice was adopted by the community during the late Second Temple period. So this is something that wasn't even started simply by the rabbinic traditions, but we do see that the shift to use pronouns as a reference to the divine name Yod He Vav He had already existed during the Second Temple period. Now, let's come to the actual question. How does the Quran understand the divine name Yod He Vav He? So remember, I said that I will be answering the question with an unanswered question. Remember the question that Pharaoh, I said, asked Moses and Aaron, who is Yod He Vav He? So let us actually look into the Exodus version of the question that Pharaoh asked, and then we will look into the Quranic versions. And I say that in plural because the Quran actually has two versions for the question that Pharaoh posed to Moses and Aaron. So in the biblical account, in the Exodus version, in the Torah, basically when Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh and they tell Pharaoh, you know, this is what Yod He Vav He commands you to do, Pharaoh asks, who is Yod He Vav He that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know Yod He Vav He, and I will not let Israel go. So here we see in the Exodus account, Pharaoh asks the question, who is Yod He Vav He? And in reality, the Exodus account does not give Pharaoh an answer to his question. So the question that Pharaoh poses to Aaron and Moses are never really answered in the biblical account. Well, how about in the Quranic version? Let's look into the Quranic version and see how the Quran re-articulates this question by Pharaoh. So for example, here in Surah Taha, we do see that Pharaoh asks, who is the Lord of you two? فَمَنْ رَبُّكُمَا? Right? Who is the Lord of you two? Remember, in the Exodus account, Pharaoh asks, who is Yod He Vav He? Right? But when you recite it, so when the Exodus account was recited by the Jewish community, they would not have recited, who is Yod He Vav He? They would have recited, who is Adonai? Who is the Lord, in other words. So here we also see the Quran using something very similar. Who is the Lord of you two? However, it is very different from the Exodus account in that the Quran actually provides an answer to Pharaoh's question. So in the biblical account, Pharaoh never receives an answer to who is Yod He Vav He. But in the Quranic version, there is an answer. And what is this answer? It says, قال ربنا الذي أعطى كل شيء خلقه ثم هدى. Our Lord is that who gives everything its creation, then guides. الذي جعل لكم الأرض مهدا وسلك لكم فيها سبلا وأنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به أزواجا من نبات شتى. The one who made the earth a cradle for you and threaded paths for you therein. He sent down water from the sky, wherewith we brought forth diverse kinds of vegetation. كُلُوا وَارْعَوْا أَنْعَامَكُمْ. Eat and pasture your cattle. منها خلقناكم وفيها نعيدكم ومنها نخرجكم تارة أخرى. From it we created you, and unto it we shall bring you back, and from it we shall bring you forth another time. So here in the Quranic version, when Pharaoh asks, who is the Lord? The Quran actually gives a response, even though in the biblical account there was no response, but in the Quranic version there is a response, there is a reply to this question. And what is this response? Who is the Lord? Well, let's look into it, each step 1 and step 2 and step. So we will look into it step by step, and we will see how in each step the Quran is actually using the rabbinic interpretation of the meaning for Yod He Vav He. So let's look, for example, in one of the answers of who is the Lord according to the Quran. It says, he who gives everything its creation and then guides. Now, when we compare this, for example, with the rabbinic tradition, for example, in Sefer Yetzirah, Sefer Yetzirah actually describes how the letters that make up the divine name Yod He Vav He constitute the building blocks of creation. And it makes a direct relationship between the divine name Yod He Vav He with the divine speech in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is the beginning of the Torah, which actually starts to talk about how God created everything, and every time that God creates something, God says, Yehi, let there be. And also remember, Yehi is based on the verb to be, which perhaps Yod He Vav He alludes to as well. So the Sefer Yetzirah is one example, but there are plenty of many different examples. And let's look into another one. In the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, for example, which is an interpretation of Exodus, the book of Exodus, in there, one of the rabbis actually states that God told Moses, Ani hu, I am he, who spoke and the world came into being. So basically it interprets, when God revealed God's self to Moses, God revealed God's self to Moses as I am he who spoke and the world came into being. Remember, just as how the Quran, for example, in Surah Taha, when it answers who is the Lord, when it answers Pharaoh, who is the Lord, it answers the Lord is who gives everything its creation and then guides. So the Mechilta actually frequently, so this rabbinic tradition, the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, frequently refers to God as he who spoke and the world came into being. Another answer that Surah Taha also gives when Moses continues to describe who God is, it describes as God is the one who made the earth a cradle for you, brought water from the sky, and had that brings forth vegetation. And then it says, eat and pasture your cattle. So this is what we see in Surah Taha. Now let's compare that with Genesis 1. Remember, much of the rabbinic traditions that attempt to describe who God is, who Yod He Vav He is, they refer back to Genesis 1. So let's look into Genesis 1 and see from Genesis 1 how God actually created the world. So when we compare this passage with Genesis, we see, for example, in Genesis, it says, then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. And the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And then we also see later on, Genesis continues. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. So remember, this also resonates strongly with Surah Taha when Moses responds to Pharaoh. It basically says, if you remember, الذي جعل لكم الأرض مهدا وسلك لكم فيها سبلا وأنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به أزواجا من نبات شتى كلوا وارعوا أنعامكم. So God is the one who made the earth a cradle for you and threaded paths for you therein. He sent down water from the sky wherewith we brought forth diverse kinds of vegetation. Eat and pasture your cattle. So we see here that the Quranic passage, when Moses is describing who God is to Pharaoh, it resonates strongly with Genesis 1, which many of the rabbinic tradition usually refers back to in their interpretation of the divine name Yod-He Vav-He. In Surah Taha, in the passage where Moses describes who his Lord is, after he actually says, that God is the one who brings forth vegetation, eat and pasture your cattle, it later then says, from it we created you, and in it we return you, and from it we will take you out again. So let's see how this actually also parallels Genesis. So in Genesis 3, we have a very similar description where it says, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, and until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So we can actually see how that passage in the Quran parallels it, because it talks about, vegetation of different kinds, and then it says, eat, right? So eat it from it, and as well as your cattle. And then it says, from it we created you, and in it we return you, and from it we will take you out again. However, as we see that in this passage in Genesis, we see two stages. From the ground you were taken, and to dust you shall return. Whereas in the Quranic passage, there are three stages. From it we created you, and in it we return you, and from it we will take you out again. So there are three stages rather than two. However, this is also not strange according to perhaps the Jewish audience of the Quran. Because in the rabbinic traditions, the way they interpreted this passage in Genesis, they actually interpreted this passage in Genesis to also be symbolizing resurrection. So they also see that there are three stages in it. So it's not simply from it we created you and in it we return you, but they also read the resurrection into this passage, as they have also read the resurrection in the previous passage that we discussed earlier. So we can see how the Quran here also parallels not simply Genesis, but even more importantly, the rabbinic interpretation of this Genesis passage. So far, we have been discussing the Quranic version of who is Yod He Vav He that Pharaoh asked from Surah Taha. However, the Quran actually has another version of this question, but in a different way. The other version, Pharaoh does not ask who is the Lord, but instead asks what is the Lord. So we will now explore how the Quran responds to Pharaoh's question, what rather than who is the Lord. In Surah Taha, Pharaoh asked, فَمَنْ رَبُّكُمَا يَا مُوسَى? And who is the Lord of you two, O Moses? Whereas another version in the Quran, Pharaoh asks Moses and Aaron, وَمَا رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ? What is the Lord of the worlds? And then a response is given. Moses' response says, the Lord of the heavens and the earth and what is in between. رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا. And then Moses continues, رَبُّكُمْ وَرَبُّ آبَاءَكُمُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. Your Lord and the Lord of your ancestors. And then Moses later on continues, رَبُّ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا إِن كُنتُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. The Lord of the east and the west and what is in between. So here we see that Pharaoh asks a different question than the version in Surah Taha. In Surah Taha, Pharaoh asks, who is the Lord? In here we see, what is the Lord? And therefore the answer Pharaoh receives in this version is very different from the earlier version. And it is something to keep in mind that in the earlier version, when Pharaoh asks, who is the Lord? Pharaoh personalized God and so received a response of a personal God. Whereas in this question, when Pharaoh asked, what is the Lord? Pharaoh depersonalized God, and therefore the response that Pharaoh receives is of an impersonal God. So let's look a little bit closer to the answers of this question in the Quran and compare it with the rabbinic tradition. So when Pharaoh asked, what is the Lord? Or what is, in other words, from the Jewish perspective, what is Yod He Vav He? Then, spatially, God is portrayed as the Lord of the heavens and the earth, up and down, the Lord of the east and the west, front and back, and all that is in between. So in other words, God is spatially, everywhere. And temporally, God is described as the Lord of those who are present and their ancestors, which means that God is the Lord of the present and the past. In other words, God is and was. So in other words, it seems how the Quran answers Pharaoh's question about what is the Lord is that the Quran is emphasizing God's nature is transcendent beyond time and space. So God transcends time and space. When we compare that with some of the rabbinic traditions, like for example in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, when it also describes Yod He Vav He, it describes Yod He Vav He as I am he who was in Egypt and I am he who was at the sea. I am he who was at Sinai. I am he who was in the past and I am he who will be in the future. I am he who is in this world and I am he who will be in the world to come. As it is said, see now that I, even I, am he. So we do see, for example, in this rabbinic tradition, that it also emphasizes that Yod He Vav He's nature transcends time and space. And by the way, the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael is also the one that also describes God, or Yod He Vav He, as the one who caused all creation. Right? It is the same Mechilta which talks about God as the one who spoke and the world came to being. So it's the same rabbinic tradition which perhaps you could say answers the question, who is Yod He Vav He, as well as what is Yod He Vav He, which apparently the Quran also takes its understanding of the divine name. So the question now is, were the Jewish audience of the Quran necessarily rabbinic? Well, in reality, not necessarily. I mean, we can't really suggest or state that they were rabbinic Jews or that they adhered to the rabbinic tradition. But at least they were familiar with the rabbinic tradition. So even if they did not adhere to the rabbinic tradition, they at least were familiar with the rabbinic tradition. So that's the least that we could say. So in conclusion, when Pharaoh asked who the Lord is, who is Yod He Vav He, he personalized God, so the answer he received describes a personal God, who through God's actions as the cause of everything. When Pharaoh asked what the Lord is, he depersonalized God, so the answer he received describes an impersonal God who transcends both time and space. Both Quranic responses to who and what is the Lord correspond to the rabbinic tradition's understanding of the meaning of the divine name Yod He Vav He. So we could say that the Quran is very much aware of the divine name Yod He Vav He and its meaning to the Jewish community, and perhaps substituting Yod He Vav He with Rabb parallels how the Jewish communities in the 7th century also avoided the pronunciation or the vocalization of the divine name Yod He Vav He. So thank you all so much for your very kind attention, and I do hope that you realize perhaps that the Quran is indeed very much aware of the divine name Yod He Vav He and alludes to it, especially for example in Surah Taha, when even before it starts narrating the story of Moses at the burning bush, already explicitly states that to God belong the most beautiful names, which means that it is implying that the story it is now about to narrate is really talking about the divine name that God had given or revealed to Moses at the burning bush. So the Quran is very much aware of the divine name Yod He Vav He, and not only is it aware of it, but it also is aware of how the divine name Yod He Vav He is interpreted through the rabbinic traditions. So thank you all so very much for your kind attention and for listening to this lecture.